Thank you, Paul, and thank you everybody for coming to this historic building. It's such an honor to give a talk here because of the role that this Meetinghouse played in the history of Biddeford, a place that means a lot to me. So today I'm going to be talking about life at Hills Beach from the end of World War I to the end of World War II. Why am I interested in Hills Beach? My mother was Priscilla Garnash. My great-grandparents were Victor and Mary Garnash, and they purchased the property along Surf Ave, the Bygraves property, and at that time the deeds went from the water to the water, so that also included the Hibbards property and Bob McManus's property. They purchased that in 1897. They rented cottages, they ran a store, and eventually when Victor died, Mary took in boarders as well. So not only did my great-grandparents have a business here, my grandmother, Irene Garnash, also had a business here. She ran a luncheonette here. And my Uncle George and Aunt Pauline rented cottages here for many years. In fact, some of you, the reason you're here is because you rented from Uncle George and Aunt Pauline when you were children or later on in life. I've been coming here all my life. This is a very special place to me, and I know from talking to many of you that you feel the same way that I do, that Hills Beach is it's paradise. It's a piece of heaven on earth. I think it's important to understand the sources of the information that I'm going to be presenting tonight. So most of my research came from exploring 2,100 early Biddeford newspaper articles. I used newspapers.com, the Maine Memory Network, the MacArthur Libraries, Ancestry.com, and both Mary Jones and Betsy Martin have some wonderful old photos that I used as well. When I did the search, last time I told you that I used the MacArthur Digital Library. They have so many things online, it's fabulous. You can find anything you want about Biddeford history. But their search is a little bit slow. So this time I used newspapers.com because it gives you a preview and you can better decide if you want to go and use that article or not, or if it's irrelevant. So newspapers.com was a much better search for me, and I found a lot more information. But I used a lot of search terms. So I used Hills Beach with an apostrophe because it wasn't always spelled Hills Beach, the Pines, Stage Basket, Negro, and Tappan Island, as well as Fort Hill. And there's a Fort Hill Ave in Old Orchard, so that newspaper.com search really helped because I could see right away, oh, this is about Fort Hill at Old Orchard, it's not about our Fort Hill, and I could skip it and move on to something that was relevant for us. So the reason I mention my sources is because to be a true history of Hills Beach, I'm going to need some old letters or some oral histories if I really want to get a full history. I don't have that yet. But you know, some of you out there might have some old letters, or you might have some old stories. And if you do, I'd love it for you to contact me. I could do an interview with you and learn what you know about Hills Beach and incorporate it into something in the future that we might talk about. I thought it would be good to recap what I covered in the previous two talks, just in case somebody might be new, or just to help set the context so that you'll remember what we talked about before and understand how we got where we are today. So in 1616, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who was a military commander and the governor of the port of Plymouth in England, he ordered Richard Vines and John Oldham to come to Maine and stay here near where the failed Popham colony was, because there was another colony in Maine before Biddeford. There were a couple, actually. But the Popham colony had failed, and he wanted to understand why. So he wanted them to stay and see, hey, can Englishmen survive the winter in that country? Because they didn't know a lot about America at the time. You know, and it wasn't America at the time. But they didn't know a lot about it. So they survived the winter thanks to the Native Americans. They didn't do it totally on their own. They got a lot of help from the Native Americans. When they came back, they were granted a patent to settle the area, but they had to have a community. They couldn't just go on their own. They had to bring a bunch of people to create a settlement there. They wound up doing that in 1630. So from that point in time, from 1630 to 1675, Hills Beach was primarily a fishing village. After that, there were the Indian Wars, and there were a few people here, but there were not a lot of people that stayed in Biddeford. In fact, there weren't city records for several of the years during the Indian Wars because the times were so difficult there. And then in 1833, the Hill family sold Basket Island and Hills Beach to Tristram Goldthwaite, who in 1887 subdivided it basically into the lots we have today. Obviously, there's been some changes, but if you look at the map, you can see that there's a lot of similarities too. And then from 1887 to 1945, Hills Beach became a vibrant summer community. This map here, this shows you where the water outside the gut was referred to as Winter Harbor, and that's, as Paul mentioned, Winter Harbor Road. That's what Hills Beach was referred to for many years in those early 17 and 1800s. This here is the stone monument. It's a dedication to Richard Vines. If you haven't seen it, it's the last house on Bridge Street before you cross the bridge to Biddeford Pool. It's in their side yard. And then this is a copy of the Goldthwaite survey. Okay, to get a sense for life at Hills Beach, we need to understand how many people were living here. We have a few sources of data. We have the U.S. Census, we have the Biddeford City Directories, we also have information from the newspapers. Now, we all know that the census is published every 10 years, and the Biddeford City Directories were frequently published every 2 years, but not consistently published every 2 years. They did skip some years. And there are times I found things in the newspapers, by the way, that I was like, somebody registered to vote and they weren't in the census. And I'm like, well, how is that possible? You can't. So there could be timing issues of when the census was collected and then somebody moved in after. So in 1920, there were 10 families living year-round at Hills Beach and Fort Hill. So back then, they made a distinction between Fort Hill and Hills Beach. And some of the people that we would call Hills Beach today, they were referred to as Fort Hill, like the Bar Cottage, which is right as you go up the hill. That was considered Fort Hill back in the day. So even though we may think of it as Hills Beach, it was both Hills Beach and Fort Hill. In 1930, there were 9 families, and then in 1940, there were 13 families. Now, according to the city directories, there were 9 in 1920 and 22 in 1941. The numbers are very similar, and in some cases it can be, I counted families, including like if somebody was boarding. The Goldthwaites, for example, on Fort Hill frequently had boarders. Mary Callahan, who ran the Hills Beach House, frequently had boarders. So the numbers could be off because of that. It's something I need to dig into further in the future. The interesting thing is, starting in 1932, there was a summer population. So they started recording the summer population by putting an S as opposed to an R for residents, and S saying they were just a summer resident. So there were 15 in 1932, and it grew to 36 by 1941. Another interesting thing is that in 1941, in the commercial section of the Biddeford City Directories, they listed the cottages by name. Now, they didn't have house numbers, just like in this, none of these censuses had house numbers for Hills Beach Road, not in the 20s, 30s, or 40s. It was just the name. And the city directory obviously didn't have it either, but they had the names of the cottages. Now, there were 32 to 35 from the period from 1920 to 1941. The city directories were not published in 42 through 45, assumedly because of the war, but the 41 was the last one. Now, there are a lot more than 32 to 35 names there, but that's because it's all the cottages in Biddeford. It includes Biddeford Pool, Fortune's Rocks. It's not just at Hills Beach and Fort Hill. And you can't see it, but the Bar Cottage, the one, I don't want to confuse the cottages. So let me make sure I get them right. The Bar Cottage, which is up right where the road divides for Sky Harbor Drive, goes around. The Bar Cottage is right there. The Bar Cottage is listed there. It was built in 1896, and in 1941 it was owned by Mrs. Mary Noyes. And then River's End, which is the other end of Hills Beach Road down by Seabreeze, that was built in 1886. and in 1941 it was owned by Frank E. Mead. So this is excellent information on trying to figure out who was where, because you get the name of the cottage and the name of the person. Since we don't have house numbers, it's difficult sometimes to try and track who owned a house unless you follow the deeds back, every time it's been sold. So a vibrant summer community needs businesses. In addition to visiting for the summer, many people visited Hills Beach whenever the weather was good. I mean, there are times when they would come in January and February, which seems odd, but there'd be a nice day and they would head down to the beach. Sometimes they'd just go to the beach to take a drive. They'd stop for a meal at one of the local restaurants, like the Hills Beach House, which was run by the Callahans. It was in operation from 1884 to approximately 1941, although not exactly sure when it stopped. Michael Callahan, who ran the Hills Beach House with his wife Mary, he passed away in 1924, and starting in 1926, Mary tried to sell the Hills Beach House. That's what this is here. This is an advertisement that she's selling: the house, store, dance hall, also house lots, and that was Mary. She had many ads, and it wasn't until 1937 that she sold it to the Reliance Corporation of Maine. So in the 30s, if you would head down to Hills Beach, you'd have multiple choices of places to eat, which is funny. You think of how developed Hills Beach is today, and there's no place to eat at Hills Beach. But in the 30s, there were multiple choices. There were the Callahans, and then Bridie Goldthwait also ran a luncheonette, and you can see her advertisement here. She had hot chicken sandwiches, clams, chicken pot pie, lobster dinners, and she even had bread and pastries. I think she accommodated parties as well. And then one of my favorites is the silver lunch, which was, you can see it says, "Look for a silver car." It was an old railroad car. And this was my grandmother, Irene Garnash, and she ran that for, I think, about 3 years. She had many ads in the newspaper for her restaurant. In addition to the restaurants, there were grocery stores. That amazes me that there were stores at Hills Beach. But there were. The Clark family had a store where Margaret and David Murray live right now. Bridie had a store as well as having the restaurant. The Moores and the Nedus also had stores. And several businesses offered delivery. Now this is Joseph Haley, who offered ice, milk, and wood for anybody at Hills Beach. In addition, for $1.25, you could get a taxi to Hills Beach from town. That's, to me, in 1928, I think that's pretty surprising that there was a taxi to Hills Beach. And there was a hairdresser at Fort Hill. Mary Goldthwait was a hairdresser at Fort Hill. And in 1938, somebody offered a business that they would pick up packages, deliver packages, or run errands for you in town. I mean, that's in 1938. I'm just really surprised that anybody was thinking of a package delivery service back then. So here's an example. I showed you this last time, but this is the Hills Beach House. This was run by the Callahans, and it's right around where Seabreeze Ave is today, across from where Pat Boston lives. That's where it was. This is an example of the store that is across from, I think it's Edgewood Place. Is that right, Margaret? Is that where that is, across the street? It's where your house is. What's the street across from your house? Oh, you don't know. Okay. So this is the old store. And I have a couple of pictures of the store. So this is one view of it very close up. That picture, by the way, was from Mary Jones. Actually, let me go back because I can't get back. That was a Mary Jones picture, and Mary Jones was the little girl on the right-hand side. I like this picture of the store because of the horse there. I mean, it really shows you how rural things were, that there was a horse right outside the store. This picture was from Betsy Martin. And then they eventually put a second story on the store. And this, again, is a picture from Betsy Martin. Now, I told you earlier about the Garnash cottages. So here are the Garnash cottages. This is the big house that's on the corner of Surf Ave and Hills Beach Road. It's that multifamily home. Right now, that's been there for many, many years, and you can see here's the Bygraves home. And this is the windmill that I mentioned in my last talk that was my great-grandmother used that to provide water to several of the residents at Hills Beach before the city put water in 1928. And then these are the cottages. And when I was a child, they went out over the water. There was a pier, and they went right out over the water. And then in the late 60s, I believe it was, a storm came and ripped that pier out, and several of the cottages, and Uncle George and Aunt Pauline didn't have quite as many cottages to rent at the time. So I mentioned Irene Garnash. I thought, my sister Margaret is always telling me I have to have more pictures. So I said I'll put in a picture of, so this is my grandmother, Irene Garnash, sitting next to her sister-in-law, Ellie St. Ange, which is David's grandmother. So despite Hills Beach being a vibrant summer community, it was impacted by the stock market crash, the Depression, and World War II. The mill started laying people off, so a lot of people were unemployed. And by the late 30s, people were having trouble paying their taxes. I did a lot of research on my family's real estate holdings at Hills Beach and found that starting in 1938, my great-grandmother wasn't paying her taxes. And as I was searching through the book, looking at the tax liens, that year, there was an entire book, 600 pages of tax liens. That seems like an astronomical amount of tax liens in 1 year. In 1936, the Biddeford City Report showed a 100% increase in tax liens over 1935. So my great-grandmother wasn't the only person who was having difficulty paying her property taxes. So during the war, 1942, the beach residents asked for a bus to take them from town down the Pool Road down to Hills Beach. Because of the rubber and gasoline shortage, it was difficult for people to get there, and they wanted a bus route. In fact, Mrs. Lawrence Moore, who owned a lot of property at Hills Beach, gathered 65 signatures on a petition to try and get that bus route established. She wasn't successful, unfortunately. Although some people had their priorities right. So Archibald Roberts, who was Sally's grandfather, he saved his gas ration coupons. He took the bus to work so he could use his coupons to drive to Hills Beach. Another thing that I found that was very interesting is during the war, and growing up, my mother used to say this all the time, we never ate seafood in my house when I was a child. And I'd ask my mother why, and she said, I ate seafood all my childhood. I am sick of it. And one of the things I found that during the war, there was a meat shortage, and a lot more people were eating clams because of it. So ferries. Last time we talked about ferries and how important the ferries were for getting people to and from Hills Beach. So in addition to automobiles, in this time period, people were using ferries were continuing to use ferries to get themselves to Hills Beach. And between 1920 and 32, the summer newspapers were full of ferry schedules and ads. There was the East End, the Eagle, and the Relief, multiple different ferry services to get you to Hills Beach. This is an example of one of the ads that was in the newspaper. In 1929, Captain Piper, who was a popular ferryman, he decided that the automobile was too much competition and he was no longer going to be in the ferry business. This is a picture of the Nimrod, of which is one of the ships he captained. He captained many ships. I don't know for certain that it is him, but this gentleman here, if you look at the picture up close, looks like a captain, so I assume that must be Captain Nimrod, but I'm not 100% positive of that. So despite his concern about the automobile competing with the ferries, in 1937, there were plans to build additional ferry slips at Hills Beach. But those ferries were going to be taking not only people, but automobiles as well. And you can see this example here. This is a scow that was planned to be used to transport automobiles and people to Hills Beach once the ferry slips were built. Because unlike, these boats, a lot of times they'd just pull them up into the sand and let the people out. Well, you can't do that with the big ships. They need to have slips built that they pull up to. So I said that Hills Beach was a vibrant social scene, right? All those ferries were needed to support the vibrant social scene. Throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Hills Beach continued to be a place for people to relax, to vacation, celebrate, and enjoy the outdoors. Many local organizations, including churches, social clubs, and civic organizations, held their annual picnics at Hills Beach. Some of those who frequently held outings at the beach were Trinity Church, the Pepperell Mills, La Voltige, did I do it right? which was one of 2 snowshoe clubs that Biddeford had. In addition, there were clam bakes, weenie roasts, hay rides, whist, and bridge parties that were frequently held at Hills Beach. So I love this picture, seeing all these people at Hills Beach. And according to this 1938 newspaper article, Hills Beach residents wanted a lifeguard because on the weekends they had 800 to 1,000 people swimming. 800 to 1,000. I said, I can't comprehend that many people at Hills Beach on the beach. Now, I did find in Mary Jones's pictures, this picture of a bunch of people bathing. It's nowhere near 800 to 1,000, but that's what the article said, which really surprised me. And then this picture here from 1942 is the Biddeford Knights of Columbus Council. They had their annual picnic down at Hills Beach. The pictures don't blow up as well as they look when they're the right size. This one, and this picture, there must be over 200 people in this picture. This was from 1938, and this was a Democratic outing held at the Garnashes, supposedly on the Garnash property, and I didn't think our property was big enough for that many people. But the Democrats weren't the only ones. In 1937, the Republicans also had an outing at Hills Beach. Okay, weather continued to be a problem. Last time we spoke, I told you about some of the storms. Well, weather continued to be a problem. There were 31 weather-related articles in this approximately 38-year period, which is a 50% increase from the last presentation, which covered about the same time period. That covered about 40 years. So severe storms occurred in many years. In particular, in November of 1919, multiple storms caused heavy destruction, flooding cottages, blowing boats clear across the pool, destroying bulkheads, and sweeping away moorings. The November storm was called the worst in memory. And after the storm, Hills Beach Road had a traffic jam because over 3,000 people came to visit the destruction, according to the newspaper. Many cottage owners moved their buildings inland after the storm, and they had some crews working to overturn Sarah Lowell's house, which got tipped upside down during the storm, to show you it's going to be pretty powerful. And in this same time period, it was reported that lightning struck 4 times. They say it never strikes twice in the same place, but Hills Beach in that 40-year period had it strike 4 times. And like the storms, high surf also caused a lot of damage. It washed out the road, destroyed bulkheads, undermined cottages. Some cottages, they wound up roping them to trees and jacking them up to prevent further damage. In addition to the storms, there were 2 occurrences where the weather was so cold that the ice froze all the way to Stage Island. In fact, in 1920, it was reported that Tristram Goldthwait and Bert Crowley, somebody you talk about a lot, Peter, walked across the gut. It's hard to imagine that the gut could freeze. So unlike the last talk, in this time period, fire was a major issue. There were 78 articles related to fires versus 5 in the last time I did a search. And again, I searched in approximately 40-year blocks. That's a big change. I don't know why all of a sudden the fires were so frequent, but there were a lot of brush fires, but there were also a lot of homes were destroyed. The fires were so frequent that the residents petitioned the city for fire protection and a hose reel. And in fact, in 1930, the town paid my great-grandmother on a regular basis to store fire equipment in her garage. Fishing and clamming, you can't have Hills Beach without fishing and clamming. They continue to be key themes at Hills Beach. Residents were concerned about outsiders digging clams and depleting the clam beds, so they had laws passed to prevent outsiders from digging clams. And in 1933, supposedly some local men, whoops, did I move on? I did. Oh no. I'm not able to go backwards. I don't know why I can't go back. Yeah, it's because I'm recording it. I think that's why. I'm sorry? No, yeah, but it's because I'm recording it. That's why it's not letting me go back. So so they closed the clam flats, and they closed them for a couple of years. And the residents complained. One of the residents who complained was my great-uncle, Will Garnash. Well, if you were caught clamming when the flats were closed, you were fined. Well, one day he was out clamming with one of his buddies, and somebody reported him, so the warden came. He knew the warden was coming, so he fled. Fled to Stage Island. And the warden got a boat and went out and got him and dragged him into court, where he pleaded guilty and paid his fine and was released. So there were a lot of people that were very upset because the clams were an important part of Hills Beach. Never did understand exactly why they closed it. There was a lot of rumors, there was a lot of speculation in the newspaper. They claimed that the reason it was closed is because it was unsafe, but the people didn't believe them. They said that there was pollution and it was unsafe. But again, when you read what the people said, they didn't feel that it was true, and they were digging them just the same. Uncle Will didn't live very long, so maybe they were unsafe. I don't know. So in addition to fishing and clamming, Hills Beach is an excellent place for boating. The 30s brought boat races along the Saco River down to Hills Beach and Camp Ellis. And the Saco Yacht Club routinely held outings at Stage Island, which is amazing to me that people had parties on Stage Island. Although I know Jeanette and Nancy like to camp out there. Over the years, boats and swimmers got into a lot of trouble in that same area. By Stage Island and Basket Island, there were boating accidents, and local fishermen were frequently rescuing people there. And there have been many ships that the Coast Guard has also rescued there. One thing that I found amazing in this time period is that there was a lot of talk about sports at Hills Beach. Sports was a new theme that I hadn't seen in any of the articles when I did my research for the previous time period. Fort Hill and Basket Island each had bowling teams, and there were 2 snowshoe clubs. There wasn't just the one I mentioned before. They had 2 snowshoe clubs, and they frequently had trips where they would snowshoe from town to Hills Beach, and they had outings. A lot of them were at the Fontaine's cottage, but there were other places where they would have their get-togethers. There were also dory races, horseshoe matches, golf, and in 1941, the Hills Beach Uplift Society, which I think is a precursor to the Hills Beach Association, they sponsored father and son baseball games, and they would play baseball at low tide on the sand. So I told you as I did this research how I was recording all the information that I found. I recorded it in a log. I would record a summary of the article, the date, the source, and then I'd create a category for it. This proved really helpful because some of you were probably there when we had the birthday party for the monument on Stage Island a few weeks back. And at that talk, somebody mentioned that they had a photograph that looked like it had been painted white. Well, I went home and I just did a search through my log and quickly found the article where it had been painted white. So I was able to confirm what they thought, that yes, it had been painted. Well, when I did that search, and when I did my search and organized things into categories, I'd read something and say, I don't know, it's quirky. And I'd just call it quirky because I didn't know what do you call some of the things that happen? Because the newspapers printed so many funny things. So now, these are things that to me are just quirky. Like in 1930, bottles of liquor, of whiskey and gin, washed up on the shores at Hills Beach. Not once, multiple times. People would go out with rakes. They'd be out getting, as soon as the tide came in, running and getting bottles. The rumor was, although nobody ever confirmed it, is that there was a rum runner ship that was being chased by the Coast Guard, so they went and dumped their stash at Stage Island, assumingly planning to go back and pick it up. And obviously they didn't bring it in far enough because the water washed it up all along the shore. So that had to have been an interesting time. They also appeared to have an election system at Hills Beach. Now, this wasn't a serious election in that it would involve the city, just that the people who lived at Hills Beach would decide, okay, you're going to be the mayor, you're going to be the commander in case we have any issues that need resolution, and they would vote. It had to be a rainy Tuesday, though. If it didn't rain on Tuesday, it got postponed to the following week because they wanted to be outside. They didn't want to be spending their time having a meeting when they could be enjoying the outdoors. So it was interesting. They did this for many years, and Charlie Clark, who's a longtime Hills Beach resident in those days, he was the mayor for many, many years. Speaking of mayors, now most of you know that Biddeford is named after Biddeford, England. There's a city in Biddeford that Richard Vines is from, and that's where Biddeford got its name. Well, back in 1928, the mayor of Biddeford in England, Mayor Goman, he came to Hills Beach and he explored Fort Hill, Biddeford Pool. He went all around and he talked about the significance, the historical significance of all these areas that he had heard about. It was nice for him to come and see it, and it was important for the people of Biddeford and Fort Hill and Hills Beach to honor him here, since that's where we got our name. So I thank you all for your time. I appreciate that you spent your time to come and hear more about Hills Beach here. I want to see if anybody has any questions, or if anybody has any old letters they want to share with me. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
So the taxi fare of $1.25, do you remember what the year was?
1928 is when he started his taxi service.
What that is in today's dollars.
Yeah, for that.
That sounds expensive.
For back then, you're probably right that that's expensive, but Margaret's going to give you the answer in about 5 seconds, I bet.
$23.61, which doesn't seem a lot in today's dollars.
Yeah, in today's dollars, if you asked an Uber to give you a ride from town to Hills Beach, I've never done it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was close to $23, because that's like 6 miles, 5 or 6 miles. So maybe that isn't unreasonable. Paul.
Where were the docks when the ferries and the vessels that were coming from Biddeford? Where did they tie up?
Much closer to where the jetty is. In fact, there are some remnants of the dock over, a lot of that part of Hills Beach, it's very rocky, and you can see some remnants from the dock out there, but they're much closer down by the jetty, down by where Callahan's were, because a lot of these people were going to parties at Callahan's. That's where a lot. You saw how big that building was. It was it was a function hall, so that's where they could have the parties. Yes.
Who owned the Jordan farm on Hills Beach Road before the Jordans owned it?
I'm sorry? Stella Maris, before the Jordans owned it. I don't know if there are 3 early family histories, the Hills, the Goldthwaits, and the Jordans, and we have representatives from the Hill family here that they pretty much all intermarried too. They're all connected. I don't know off the top of my head who owned that before the Jordan family. Yes. Yeah. In fact, in the census, Stella Maris was a separate page And I believe it was either the 1930 or maybe the 1940 census where Stella Maris had a separate page for all the people living at Stella Maris, which I was surprised. Yes?
So were most of the seasonal families that were in Hills Beach, did they actually reside in the Biddeford-Saco area?
So from what I've been able to find, I would say maybe about half of them did. It doesn't seem like they all did, but that's something that I still need to dig into. I think I mentioned before that there aren't street numbers in the old deeds. Things are the way they're listed. It's it's next to John Smith's house and so-and-so's house. It's not easy to trace it back, but it's one of the things that I want to try and work on next is to understand more about the families. Yes.
When we moved here in 2004, the people we bought from, their name was Casey. Mm-hmm. And so for the first year, we didn't say we lived at 130 Hills Beach Road. We said we lived at the Casey's home. I'm just wondering, like you said, all the deeds refer to names, not numbers. Whether that was commonplace, that if you bought a place, you would refer to it as the predecessor or owner, as opposed to give someone reference.
Yes, I think so, because I got to tell you, all the deeds I've looked at, they all refer to, so I have to get, in fact, Janice Murphy just gave me a paper copy of the Goldthwaite survey, so I can lay it out and try and, if I put the names near, I can start and try and figure out who lived where. But it's very challenging without street numbers, and the references are very hard to follow. Yes.
The K property at the end at
Yes.
Fort Hill, was that before 1945 or after?
Oh, no, it was bought before that because he actually got a permit when he bought it to do some renovations. And I'm trying to get more information on permits. Sometimes it was published in the newspaper when somebody bought it and they got permits and were going to do renovations, but it wasn't always. There was a lot of renovations in cottage building in the late 1920s, an awful lot happening at Hills Beach.
So that K, Dr. K?
I believe it's Dr. Kurth, Kurth, was the name of the family. Yeah. And I think everybody just wound up calling him Dr. K, but it was the Kurth family that bought it. And they bought it in this time period. Yeah.
And then you also had on one of your slides something at the Roulette residence. Is that Eddie Roulette that was across the street from Baldwin's? Rose and Eddie Roulette lived across the street from Baldwin's.
If you know that and you know they lived in that time period, that probably is. There are several families that seem to host a lot of the events. Like one is my family, the Garnashes. They hosted a lot of events. The Fontaines hosted a lot of events. The Goldthwaites hosted a lot of events. I'm not remembering all the names, but there were probably 6 or 7 families that hosted the majority. Everybody had parties, for their family. But there were people like the same families hosted the Trinity Church every year, and things like all the church functions didn't seem to go to Callahan's. They seemed to go to somebody's home is where their base was for the party.
I heard you mention the name Fontaine a couple of times. I'm not familiar with that.
That's one of the reasons why I want to get the map and figure out where people lived. I believe his name was Emile, E-M-I-L-E, and he also owned a garage downtown, which I'm assuming was like a mechanical garage where you had your cars fixed based on how it was written in the newspaper. But I haven't figured that out, and that's, like I said, why I want to lay that out, because when you read like about a fire in the newspaper and they say it was near so-and-so's house, it'll help. You can start to figure out, okay, well, then they must have lived here. And then trace the deeds back to figure it out for certain, but I don't know that.
There were Fontaines on Breakwater Avenue.
Oh, there were?
I don't know if that was a legacy that was continued from
Okay.
this particular Fontaine.
Okay.
Yeah. We were kids.
Yeah. Yeah. David and Nancy grew up at Hills Beach. She never grew up. So they weren't just summer residents, so they knew a lot more about Hills Beach because they were there year-round. Al.
Diane, you need to explore this fire in the garage because you're probably going to find out that that was our great uncle and he fled to Canada after because they were looking for him.
So was it Will?
No, two brothers owned the garage.
Yeah.
And one of them, they said, set the fire, took off to Canada, the other one stayed, just he had nothing sold it, nothing to do with the fire.
Oh. Well, the Uncle Will Garnash that I referred to was quite a character.